Good evening. Welcome to this very special Guardian live event. I'm Jonathan Freedland. I'm a Guardian columnist, and I'm in conversation tonight with a very special guest, former Senator for the state of New York, former Secretary of State, and former Democratic presidential nominee. Our guest tonight is Hillary Rodham Clinton. We're together for an hour, and we will be discussing Hillary Clinton's extraordinary career in US politics. But as we have been marking the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, we will also be asking whether 20 years on from that September day, whether we are looking at a world that is a safer place than it was then. And we'll be looking at the events that have unfolded ever since. Just a word or two about how we're going to be doing things. Some of you have been sending in questions in advance to Secretary Clinton, and we are grateful for those. We'll be coming to those. You can also send in questions as the evening goes on by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we're going to try and get through as many of those as we possibly can in the second part or so of our hour together. And if you're watching on a tablet or mobile, you'll find the Q&A function in the menu there. So on to our guest. Hillary Rodham Clinton has been a pivotal figure in American politics for the best part of 3 decades, but certainly in the 20 years since 9/11, absolutely central figure in the life of the country. She was a senator for New York at the time of those attacks, went on to become Secretary of State in the administration of Barack Obama between 2009 and 2013, a period in office that included the death of Osama bin Laden, and in 2016 famously became the first female presidential nominee, famously winning the popular vote, but of course losing the White House to Donald Trump. Hillary Rodham Clinton, it is an absolute pleasure to have you with us for this Guardian Live event. Thanks so much for joining us from your home in Chappaqua, New York. I've been having lots of conversations over the last few days and weeks with people about 9/11. And the first question to all of them is what I'm going to put to you first tonight, which is just where were you on 9/11 and what do you remember of that day?
Well, Jonathan, thank you for having me and for covering this 20th commemoration year of the 9/11 attacks. I was, as you said, a serving senator from New York. I was on my way to the Senate for my day of work when the first plane hit. And we thought, like so many did, that it was just a terrible, tragic accident. And I drove to the Senate building, and on my way, the second plane hit. So by then, we knew, of course, it was not an accident. It was an act of terrorism. Our staff, as was the entire Senate and the Congress, being evacuated to safety because there was a very legitimate fear that the next target would be the U.S. Capitol, which indeed we believe it was. The plane that went down in Shanksville, we think, was headed toward the Capitol. So after being sure that my staff was safe, we got them set up in a friend's home nearby, Capitol Hill. I went home and began calling everyone that I could to find out what had happened, what we needed to be doing. And of course, watching what was being displayed on our TV screens, which was just devastating in every way as we learned more and more about the attacks and about the collapse of both buildings and the extraordinary loss of life. Because I was a senator, my colleague and I, Chuck Schumer, flew to New York the next day, and I will never forget. First, we were the only plane in the sky besides fighter jets that were providing a cover over the East Coast. And then we got into a helicopter at LaGuardia Airport and flew over ground zero. And it was truly as much of a depiction of hell, Dante's Inferno, whatever one wants to envision, much more overwhelming than the TV screen, which of course had to limit what it saw. And we could see the whole expanse of destruction. The fires were still burning. First responders and volunteers were helping to look through the rubble, trying to find survivors. And I spent the entire day then in New York before going back to Washington late that night to start working on the recovery program that was needed.
Did you imagine then that the consequences of what you had just seen from the air as you went over in that helicopter, that the political consequences of that would be enduring for 20 years? And I'm thinking quite specifically because it was a matter of days later, I think it was on September the 18th, 2001, where you and the entire Senate voted on the authorization of military force, which gave the president, George W. Bush, then a mandate really to do whatever he decided he needed to do. Did you think then that it was possible that United States troops, forces would be in Afghanistan for 20 years?
Jonathan, I don't think any of us really could have foreseen at that time what the next 20 years would bring. There was a very strong consensus, not only in the Congress, but also in the country, to try to bring to justice those who had attacked the United States. And they were located, insofar as our intelligence and every other piece of public information told us, in Afghanistan. And remember at that point that then President Bush did say in addressing the Taliban, if you will break relations with Al Qaeda, you will not give them refuge and sanctuary in your country. Just let us have them, and that will be the end of it. And the Taliban would not do that. And it then became a matter of trying to track down bin Laden and his leaders, and eventually bin Laden himself hiding in Pakistan 10 years later.
I mean, I suppose what's behind my question is the sense that given everything that has happened since, the idea that for 20 years, nearly 3,000 American lives, the president now, Joe Biden, estimates that $1 trillion has been spent in the intervening 20 years. Do you think now, and of course we've got the hindsight now, but do you think, given that the Taliban were in then and they're back in now, that these last 20 years of life and treasure has been a waste?
I would not say that. I think we have to look at what also has been accomplished in the last 20 years. The United States has not been attacked from Afghanistan again. And in those initial months and years following 9/11, that was a very real possibility that those of us who were in positions of responsibility had to face as to whether or not there could be enough capacity left in Al Qaeda or like minded terrorist groups to launch attacks, not only at the United States, but obviously in Europe with other of our friends and allies. We also developed a much more effective system of intelligence and response to potential threats. Now, one can say, well, could that have been done more quickly? Perhaps, but it was putting together intelligence resources, political and military resources, working on a bilateral basis with many countries, also through organizations like NATO, to try to share the information that would keep us safe. And so I think we are much further along now than we were certainly 20 years ago. In our country, we learned some very painful lessons. The sort of lack of information sharing between the FBI and the CIA. And I know that you had a chance to talk to former Governor Kane, who was one of the two co-chairs of the 9/11 Commission. We've restructured our government. We've tried to foresee additional threats because they're not all going to come from Afghanistan. Obviously, we know that now. And I really do want to underscore that although many people, and I certainly respect their assessment, have said we should have gotten out earlier, we didn't need to stay that long. We never could have done the bin Laden operation if we had not been in Afghanistan. I was one of the small group of people advising President Obama about that. And the Navy SEALs came from and returned to Afghanistan in order to uh, bring bin Laden to justice. We also had a very positive effect on the lives of many Afghans, something that I personally am very grateful for. Women and men, boys and girls were going to school. Healthcare was much better. But there were weaknesses, and those weaknesses in the governance of Afghanistan, in the military resources of Afghanistan itself, were very difficult to ignore. And I think there were several decisions made leading up to President Biden's decision to finally leave, but the most telling and consequential was President Trump's decision to tell the Taliban that the United States would be gone by May 1st and to sign an agreement with the Taliban without including the Afghan government at all, more than a year before the actual withdrawal took place. The Taliban knew we were leaving, and so we hadn't even gotten that first demand from President Bush: break ties with Al Qaeda, which they have never done. And it was not important to then President Trump. And the consequence, I believe, was that the Taliban had many months to intimidate, coerce, extort people from, turning their backs on the Afghan government, even leaving the Afghan military. So there should be no surprise that the Taliban was well positioned once the actual withdrawal of American troops began to take over the country again.
I mean, presidents are able to reverse the decisions of their predecessors. If you had been sitting around that table advising President Biden the way you were advising President Obama, would you have said, look, we haven't got what we came for, and we should not withdraw? And actually, we do need that presence in Afghanistan, as you mentioned, to do the raid for bin Laden required it. There may be future operations. Would you have advised President Biden not to withdraw, or certainly not withdraw now?
I don't think he had that choice, Jonathan. I think that it was way too far gone. And I respect the decision to leave. But in effect, President Biden's hands were tied because the Taliban had made it very clear there would be a ceasefire with respect to the American presence in Afghanistan, not only the military, but also the civilian presence, which was considerable. But if there was any effort to go back on the deal that Trump had made, then that ceasefire would end. And that would have put President Biden in an impossible position because I believe that our casualties, both military and civilian, would have increased dramatically. And it would have then required either withdrawing in the face of greater casualties or putting in more troops, which there was no appetite for. I do think it's very important to give the Biden administration credit for pulling off a rather remarkable evacuation effort under really difficult circumstances, focusing as they needed to on American citizens, on Afghans who had worked directly for the American government. And the real challenge are all those Afghans who bought into democracy, bought into changing gender roles, who were in government, the media, education, healthcare, business, all the professions, and particularly the women, who I've been very focused on, because they had done so much to try to make up for lost time, first with the Soviet occupation, and then with the warlords, the Civil War, the first reign of the Taliban. And they were trying incredibly hard to really provide better opportunities for, women and men. And I'm afraid that all will be lost. So we do need to continue to do what we can to support those Afghans who are left, and try to continue to evacuate as many who need to leave because of the dangerous position they find themselves in.
I mean, that's the point when you say that will all be lost. I think that's what really hits people very directly. You mentioned the case of women and changing gender roles. That you were hugely associated with that issue. Even today, there's been footage out of Afghanistan of a woman being arrested and beaten by Taliban police, it seems, on the streets. Women's sport banned, an all-male government. To think, I go back to that figure of 3,000 dead, $1 trillion. If in the end all it bought was a 20-year window where things were better, and then it goes back to the dark ages again, surely that makes you think this was, in a way, futile.
No, I think, look, when you look at historic trends and events, it's often very difficult to know how they will eventually be judged. What I do regret is that the Trump administration negotiated a deal that was, free of any obligations by the Taliban whatsoever. I think that was a grave mistake, because then not only the United States, but the rest of the world, including in the region directly affected, has very little leverage right now. There's a lot of talk about how Russia and China are going to try to fill the vacuum, how Pakistan is going to be, in effect, the puppeteer. Well, be careful what you wish for, because there has been, as far as we can see as of today, little to no change whatsoever by the Taliban in how they intend to govern, how they expect to treat people, whether it's journalists who are trying to provide some kind of objective reporting, or women who want to continue their education and their work. So we have several big issues that the entire world, not just the United States, need to pay attention to. One is the refugee flow of Afghans leaving. Yes, 124,000 were taken out by the Americans, about another 100,000 plus taken out in other ways from other governments, charter planes and the like. But the real rush of refugees will be coming over the border into Pakistan, into Iran, into Uzbekistan, into neighboring countries, and then moving, trying to get to Europe, trying to get elsewhere. So we're going to have to figure out what to do about that. And then, of course, we have to be vigilant about potential terrorist threats that will not only be directed perhaps at the United States, perhaps at Europe. But remember, Pakistan, which has covertly supported the Taliban for years, will find itself with an unreconstructed Taliban on its border, with their own internal jihadist Islamist forces. They have a huge nuclear arms program. There is a lot to worry about with Pakistan being in a position where they're trying to mastermind what happens in Afghanistan, fully aware that what's happened in Afghanistan is giving a lot of aid and comfort to their own internal jihadist threat. So this is by no means over. It's probably more over for the United States than it might be for some of the countries in the region. But even we have to remain very focused on making sure that Al-Qaeda, ISIS, which was responsible for the attack on the gate at the airport, killing 13 Americans and dozens of Afghans trying to get onto the airport grounds, there may well be an internal struggle between the Taliban and ISIS, and then they will be out jihading each other, trying to be even more extreme to keep the allegiance of, the majority of the rural Afghan community, which will offer them, support and refuge. So this is a very complicated situation going forward. And I think everyone needs to continue to pay attention. Let's not make the mistake that we made after the Soviet Union pulled out and ignore what happens in Afghanistan.
I'm very shocked by your suggestion that Donald Trump might not be the great deal maker after all.
Yes, I knew you would be shocked, Jonathan. I hope you will be able to continue the conversation despite that shock. Well, it wasn't even, it wasn't, and when one thinks about it, he put pressure on the Afghan government to let loose 5,000 prisoners that had been taken off the battlefield by the Afghans and the Americans working together. And he pressured Pakistan to release Baradar, the sort of commander-in-chief of the Taliban. So when we say, are you surprised that the Afghan military collapsed? Well, first of all, they took enormous casualties for a very long time. And the core of their special forces kept fighting. But the average, military recruit into the Afghan military, people that they'd picked up on the battlefield were back after them. The Taliban was going to their village tribal leaders saying, you need to get on our side now because the Americans are leaving. Donald Trump signed this agreement, so come on. So, yeah, I think that any hope that we could have had to have more leverage to try to pressure the Taliban was lost under the Trump administration. And now we're going to have to be as vigilant and careful as we can going forward.
But just talking about him, this is just something that I thought about often in the preceding 4 years. Did you, every day Donald Trump, did something like this, put your sort of palm to your forehead and think, if only I had somehow got 10,000 more votes in Michigan or 10,000 more votes in Pennsylvania, somehow this madness could have been averted?
Well, of course, I think that. I thought it every day during the 4 years of his administration. But I think what is really most concerning is that he continues to be destructive. The January 6th insurrection at our Capitol was a terrorist attack. And I applaud former President George Bush for saying so at the 9/11 commemoration in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. We are now much more worried about internal threats. And there are some who say you can't equate them. I mean, having planes flown into the World Trade Center and the terrible loss of life, and let's never forget what was done that day. Of course, that's a horrific external attack. But now we are engaged in a very serious, unfortunate but real battle for our democracy against forces either led by or inspired by Donald Trump, who are undermining our institutions, who seem to have great contempt for the rule of law, who want to undo our whole election apparatus. So I think people who are looking at what's happening inside the United States right now should be concerned about his continuing undermining of our institutions, our rule of law, and our democracy.
Yeah, and as you were saying with Afghanistan, that's not over. He does continue to play that role. I'm interested in your point about language and about whether you call it terror or not. Just in the last couple of days, the head of MI5, one of Britain's intelligence agencies, said that in retrospect, it was a mistake calling it the war on terror. And he said the reason why was it flattered Al-Qaeda into treating them as soldiers or somehow on a par with the Western nations they were fighting. And he now thinks in retrospect they should have called them violent criminals and so on. The very language of a war was a mistake, he now thinks. I wonder where you stand on that 20 years on.
Well, they certainly were criminals, but they were also terrorists. You could be a criminal and not be a terrorist, but I don't think you could be a terrorist and not be a criminal. I mean, part of the challenge is recognizing that bin Laden had declared war against the West in the 1990s.
But in a way, maybe don't do him the favor of accepting that terminology. So you may say that, but as far as we're concerned, you're a terrorist criminal and we're going to come and get you, but we're not going to say we're at war with you because you're beneath us.
I think that would have been very difficult in our country. You know, you said we had voted on the authorization to use military force. It would have been very hard to send in our military after a criminal. You need some nexus between our national security and the use of our military in a foreign country. And so I think that would have been hard. I think also NATO invoking Article 5 common defense provision was a very significant commitment by our closest allies to trying to go after using military means, not law enforcement tools, those who had attacked us. So I get the point that the director of MI5 is making. I understand that point, but it would have been really difficult to muster the resources we needed. Now, you can send in law enforcement, but we didn't have that. You weren't going to send the FBI to Afghanistan. So I think we had to see it as a military undertaking in order to muster the resources we needed to go after those who had attacked us.
Yes, we're going to probably come back to some of this when we get to our readers and viewers' questions. But I wanted to mention, just to move in some ways to more domestic matters, but there is a bridge between the two. There was a cartoon in one of the American papers of two Afghan women in burqas, and one says to the other, "Pray for the women of Texas." And it's a reference there, as you know, to this very restrictive, in some ways the most restrictive change in abortion rights in the United States since Roe v. Wade nearly 50 years ago. I wondered, because of decisions like that and others, do you worry that the United States might have lost the right, you could say, to lecture other countries or even to lead other countries on women's rights?
No, because we're talking about, the law of one state, which the government of the United States under President Biden is challenging. The Attorney General, Merrick Garland, has made very clear that this administration believes that Texas law is unconstitutional, and that will be battled out in the courts. But, we all have to be aware that we fall short of our own ideals and values, but that doesn't mean we don't keep trying. And it certainly doesn't mean that we give up being aspirational, hopeful, and even optimistic to try to do everything we can to set a higher goal, even set a higher standard for what we expect. There's a lot of evidence now, Jonathan, that when faced with populism, nationalism, certainly with the kind of religious fundamentalism that we are seeing in Afghanistan, what is the first thing they do? They try to tighten the space for women. They try to undermine autonomy for women. I've been saying for many years that one of the clearest indicators of threats to democracy, of the kind of growing threat of authoritarianism, is what leaders do to try to limit the aspirations, the rights, and opportunities of women. So if you look at what's happening in two of our states run by Republican governors, you have an anti-science, anti-evidence, anti-factual, anti-women kind of agenda. And that's true on both vaccines and trying to keep the very people you are responsible for helping, those that are your constituents, making it difficult to keep children safe because of the rules that they are imposing, no masks, the refusal to mandate vaccines in so many settings. So we know that appeals to an authoritarian, group of people who claim that they're above the law, that their freedom matters more than anything, that they can do or say anything, that They are, to be considered the arbiters of our health, our safety, and our rights. And this is one of the big battles. And it's not only in the United States. There are other countries. Afghanistan is a very extreme example, but there are other countries where, people are using authoritarian kinds of regimes to tighten the space for women. So, no, I think that we have a president who is very strongly on the side of women's rights and opportunities. And we have still a large majority of Americans who have the same set of feelings. And we should not be intimidated, and we should not in any way give in to the populist authoritarian leadership and followers that are vying for Donald Trump's support and approval, because, that is going to undermine freedom and opportunity for everybody if they're not careful.
Yeah, I think people will be fascinated to hear you talking about managing to retain some of that kind of optimism, because I mentioned there about Roe v. Wade being eroded. The law in Texas, for anyone not aware of that, is suggesting that abortion in effect banned from 6 weeks after into a pregnancy. And of course, there's, that can amount to 2 weeks or less for a woman who once she knows she's pregnant. That erosion coming 50 years after a breakthrough like Roe v. Wade. We've talked about Afghanistan, similar thing. These are gains that in some ways somebody like you would have thought, that you could tick that box 40 or 50 years ago. We've done that. And instead, here you are now, 50 years on, having to go back and fight that. And I was thinking that the challenges are not just without, they're also within. And you're obviously tremendously associated. You're seen, I think, to embody a particular kind of strain of feminism. And I wondered the extent to which it depresses or dispirits you that feminism itself, the feminist movement, is now so divided. And I'm thinking of a book which is beginning to get a lot of attention by Rafia Zakaria called Against White Feminism, a woman of color saying that the problem is white feminism, a division within the feminist movement. How troubled are you by that?
Oh, not very. I mean, look, I think it's great to have vigorous discussion and debate about the path forward, what it means to be a feminist. I have a very simple explanation, which is that, women are entitled to equal rights and opportunities to men in every aspect of society. So, yes, of course, there are much more complicated and difficult conversations around all of what that means and how it's implemented. But when you have Republican elected officials who defend the kind of draconian anti-abortion, anti-choice laws like we see in Texas, calling women host bodies, that's really a threat to all women. That's not, that crosses every color line and every other line. So you ask if I'm, surprised or discouraged. I'm neither. I'm not surprised because I've been involved in the women's movement, the civil rights movement. I've seen the forces that are arrayed against progress when it comes to women's autonomy, when it comes to the advancement of civil and political and economic rights. I know very well that the other side, to put it very simplistically, never gives up, Jonathan. They are relentless in their view of what is a properly constructed society. And in that view, white men are at the very top and nobody else is even close. And so it is something that we are reliving. We fought a civil war over this. And if you go back and look at the lead up to our Civil War, the kind of language that was used, if you look at what happened after that war, when there was Reconstruction and then there was a big uprising against that and a rewriting of history to try to make, the South's battle against slavery seem somehow noble instead of a very clear defense of property that they didn't want to lose and the economic benefit that flowed from it. This is a story that is as deep and long as human nature has been around. And you cannot be surprised when they regroup and they keep coming after you and they keep trying to beat you down and disassociate your values from the real underlying values that I think the United States stands for. So you can't get discouraged. You have to accept the fact that power does not give up without a fight. And even if you move forward to a certain extent where it becomes, more limited, or it's no longer considered appropriate to be as open in your white supremacy or your patriarchal views or all the rest that go with it, you have to realize that what Donald Trump did was to make it respectable again. He sort of lifted the top off of Pandora's box and said, go forth and say whatever you want to say because you deserve to be on top. And I'm here to help you get there and stay there. So you've got to be willing to stay in the arena.
Yeah, I'm going to press this point though about the division. I don't know if you've seen this show, The White Lotus, because you're mentioned in it. In the first episode, it's to bring out the notion of a generational divide. There's a character played by Connie Britton who idolizes Hillary Clinton and just thinks Hillary Clinton is what it's about. And her daughter and her daughter's friend kind of roll their eyes at that, as if to suggest there's a generational divide in how these two generations see feminism. And particularly, and often that divide is over the issue of trans rights, which the young generation think are pushing, and then on the other side the notion of feminism demanding single sex spaces for women. And this TV show sort of brought you into that. As I say, I don't know if you saw it, but it seemed to me a moment, and I wonder what you think of that divide and whether it is difficult for feminism, and where you yourself stand, whether, for example, you can say, as I think those young characters in that show would want you to say, trans women are women. Is that a sentence you can say?
Look, generational change not only should be expected, but welcomed. I haven't seen the show. I can't comment on it. I love Connie Britton, by the way. But
I think it's mutual from the show.
Yeah, well, I think, Jonathan, that, the expansion of LGBTQ rights has been phenomenal. It's probably the fastest moving civil rights movement in human history. I mean, it really, once it became organized and people were demanding their rights and standing up for themselves, it's been revolutionary. And that has happened within the lifetime of younger women and younger men, right? Because it's been like the last 20, 25 years, really, where it had a huge propulsion. But I was around when there were schools I couldn't go to because I was a woman, where there were jobs I couldn't apply to because I was a woman, where there was a very clear distinction between what was appropriate and not appropriate for a woman in the workforce. So for me and for someone like Connie Britton, sort of close to my generational experience, we remember all of that. I was an adult woman when Roe v. Wade was decided. And like most women of, my generation, we knew the terrible stories about back alley abortions. So for us, this is very real. It is part of our lived and learned experience. And I don't think there should be any kind of conflict between expanding rights and recognizing identity and the rest. But there needs to be a recognition that the fights we thought had been won back in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the 90s are still under attack from those who do not want to see those really fundamental changes that young women today kind of take for granted. And I think actually the Texas law has really woken up a lot of young people, young women and young men. It's like, wait, you mean that's real? It could actually happen? 6 weeks? Are you kidding? And so maybe it has to be very much part of the zeitgeist of the moment for people of all ages to grasp the challenges that we're facing. So I'm going to stay very focused on, defending and speaking out and advocating for, what I consider to be the grounding of feminism. We have a right to have autonomy over our lives and our bodies. We are not host bodies. We are equal human beings. And so if we're still having that argument, I think it's great to keep going and to expand more rights and talk about more, opportunities for people. But everybody needs to realize there are powerful forces, ideological forces, religious forces, even financial forces, who would be perfectly happy to turn the clock back. And so I've lived through that. I understand that. And that's where my attention is focused.
And so within those rights that still have to be fought for and protected, would those that include, for example, rights determined by sex rather than gender for female-only spaces?
I think those are all, that's what people are arguing about right now. I don't know how that's going to play out, but I understand
Where do
it.
you stand on it?
Well, but for example, let's just say that in a country like India, which has had some horrific gang rapes of young women on public transportation going home from work, there is a movement in India to try to get more protection on public transportation, including, if necessary, women-only transportation. I'm not going to substitute my view here in the United States for what very vocal and very determined women in a country that has had these terrible gang rapes thinks could help keep women secure. So a lot of this is situational, and what we want is to protect and nurture the rights and opportunities of all women and girls. And in some cases, that's as basic as keeping them safe when they are out in public. So I'm going to listen and learn as a lot of very really determined and strong women on the front lines, literally across the globe, try to tackle these issues.
Thank you. We have had many questions that have come in. I've got tons of questions I still want to ask, but let's bring in some of our readers. And quite a lot of them are going back to the question we talked about Afghanistan, and wondering whether, for full closure, there does need to be, some are suggesting, an apology by the United States for the 20-year-long occupation of Afghanistan, or a statement that accepts failure. What do you think about that? That the United States making a statement? I don't know whether the word defeat has been used yet, but do you think it would be helpful for the United States and its leaders to talk in the terms that several of our readers are writing in with?
Well, no, I don't agree with that. I think what President Biden has said is that the most important mission was finished, that there was no, in his view, there was no reason to continue a presence in Afghanistan, especially given the fact that the Afghan government, which had been given a lot of support and a lot of resources over many years, was not able to sustain itself. So, I think that, people look at this one example, and I think it's a much more complex and layered situation than perhaps many are giving it credit for. And as I said in the beginning, I think that, preventing further attacks, being able finally to bring bin Laden to justice, giving a chance to the Afghan people that elected their leaders, and that was an enormous step forward for them, but not able to consolidate those gains, not able to, keep going without being, in effect, propped up and supported. I think that that was certainly a very important effort, and I don't think there's anything to apologize for trying to, provide the kinds of support for the Afghan people. And by so many measurements, for those 20 years, a very big percentage of the Afghan people were better off. And so, yes, I think there's a complicated set of circumstances to look at, but I certainly don't think that, the president needs to say any more than what he said. As far as he's concerned, there was no further reason to stay.
What about the civilians killed in drone strikes over the years, including just as the United States left? I think 10 people were killed really in the almost the very last act of American involvement. But those figures run into many thousands, I think, over the 20-year period. Should there be an apology to those families?
I don't know that the numbers run into the thousands. That's not my information based on what I used to be able to see when I had access to it. Of course, it's always a terrible outcome if innocent people are killed in any act of war. That's true anytime war takes place anywhere in the world. But I don't think that there can be a very clear and definitive assessment, because the information was often, very difficult to come by. And lots of times those who were targeted by drone strikes were on their way to do great damage to many more innocent civilians. And unfortunately, sometimes, the targets were either not alone or the damage went further than it was intended. But I think that certainly, based on what I know, based when I was getting the intelligence, when I was part of the administration, every effort was made to avoid that kind of casualty.
Patsy Hickman writes, now that President Biden has smashed the age barrier for the presidency, please would you smash the remaining shards for women? I think Patsy might be thinking of the glass ceiling that was shattered into a million pieces. Will you run? We know it's exhausting and you've had bad luck, but this is important and it is your time, says Patsy Hickman. And I would add to that, of course, Joe Biden did run 3 times and got there in the end, and you have only run twice. So his third time, what do you think?
I thank you, Patsy, for that vote of confidence. That really is very meaningful, but I have no intention or plan to run again. I'm going to do everything I possibly can to elect people who I think are right for the country. And it won't surprise you to hear that I think the Republican Party has literally lost its mind. So I'm going to be working very hard to elect Democrats from the White House, all the way down the ballot.
And you say no intentional plan, but also no desire. I wonder if this is the kind of bug that one never really gets rid of. Is that completely out of your system, that urge to be president of the United States?
Well, Jonathan, I'm constantly thinking about what we should do and how we can do it. But I don't say if I were there. I say, what can I do to help try to get, this idea to the right people, or how can we support what the president's trying to do? That is, certainly, something I think about all the time.
You once said something that really interested me. It interested me at the time, and I looked at it again, and it interested me again. You said, I'm not a natural politician, in case you haven't noticed, like my husband or President Obama. And I wondered what you had in mind of what your image of a natural politician was, and whether, and I know we're going back to the gender thing, but whether in a way the natural politician template in your mind is quite a male template. I mean, are there women who you would say, yeah, that's a natural politician, in a way that I, Hillary Rodham Clinton, am not a natural politician?
No, it really is more about the image of a, quote, natural politician that most people have in their heads. And, when I was running, occasionally people would approach me or somebody I was working for, and they would say, I want her to change the way she speaks, or I want her to, do this or that. And my staff got very used to it. And their reaction always was to ask, well, who do you have in mind? And they would say, well, she needs to talk like her husband, or she needs to talk like, President Obama. And they would say, well, tell us a woman she needs to talk like. And literally people would be dumbfounded. So I was making the point that, look, I was trying to become president, which in our country is head of state as well as head of government. I therefore would have been, quote, commander in chief, which is the role, one of the roles the president plays. And, you know, I knew that I had to overcome so much of this embedded view about what a leader looks like, what a leader sounds like. You know, I was fascinated to go to your first woman prime minister for a moment, Margaret Thatcher. I mean, she changed the tenor and tone of her voice. She changed her appearance, you know, her teeth and other things. She changed her hairstyle. She changed her clothing. And it wasn't, it was, you know, intended to sort of imbue her more with some of the characteristics that, you know, the people of Great Britain would think of as being a leader. So yes, a lower timbered voice, for example. So I think that my point really was we had two great two-term Democratic presidents in the last, you know, 28 or so years, you know, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. And if you really, you know, they're both tall, you know, one may be white, one may be black, but they both have a charisma. They have a real sense of intellectual heft, plus, you know, a sense of humor and all the rest of it. And I was trying to kind of get people to question their internal views of what a leader looked like and sounded like.
But it sounds like, yes, you did have what you were drawing attention to was there is a male template of the natural politician
It
in our
is.
head, and you
It is.
were challenging
And I
that.
wanted
But
to
what's
bring
the
it out in the open. I mean,
yeah?
why pretend that there wasn't, right?
And but what was the answer to your own question to those women? When I know it was your staff who would say to people, "So who's the woman?" Do you see a woman around? I think in your own country, but if you see one abroad, great, mention that, who does fit that template of the natural politician. I'm very interested in what you mentioned: charisma and sense of humor and intellectual heft. Do you see a woman around who fits that kind of Bill Clinton, Barack Obama natural politician template? Or is the only way, actually, America's going to elect a woman president is when it finally gets rid of that template altogether?
I think there are a lot of really incredibly able, smart, effective women in politics right now, starting with our vice president, Kamala Harris. And here's what's really wonderful, Jonathan, and it's an advantage that I didn't have. I was always the only woman. In 2008, I was the only woman. In 2016, I became the first and only woman. I'm the only woman to ever who's won a primary or a caucus. So I was on the front lines of people's consciousness. And so if they didn't like my hairstyle or they didn't like my voice or whatever it is, it was all, you know, focused on me. Now we have many more women who are out there, who are competing, who are in the public awareness. You know, men run for office. They're all sizes and shapes and frankly, hairstyles and everything else, but they all have the benefit of being, you know, the male in the arena. And so now we're going to have different women who are going to be taller and shorter and different hairstyles and wear pants, wear skirts, whatever. I think that will go a long way toward beginning to break down the stereotype because, oh, okay, I like so-and-so. She's my governor. She's my senator. She's my vice president. Oh, okay. And there's enough women in the, you know, arena, so to speak, that it can begin to undermine. There's only one way to look at the highest office in our land, and that is through a male perspective.
You know, the other thing we should always say about this, before we get carried away with the idea that the country couldn't accept, etc., you did win the popular vote. You did win 3 million more votes than your opponent. And so, you know, before we overanalyze America's unwillingness to embrace a woman president, you know, electorally, millions more voted for a woman president than voted for Donald Trump.
Yeah.
It's just,
and you know what's really interesting,
you have a slightly
Jonathan,
messed up system. Yes.
We have a very messed up system. And for the really, you know, very geeky members of the audience, you know, as you said, there was about a 70,000 plus vote difference between me and Donald Trump in the Electoral College, and I had 3 million more votes. Joe Biden, who beat Trump much more handily in the popular vote even than I did. The margin was about 100,000. Part of the reasons the Republicans are so angry about the outcome of the election is they didn't think they would lose Georgia by, 15,000 or Arizona by 16,000, or they thought that they would not lose those states. And they cannot literally imagine that they did. So they make up the big lie. But think about it. You could have someone who wins by nearly 10 million votes and still lose the Electoral College under our crazy dysfunctional system, which is a remnant of, frankly, compromises with slave states. So yes, I did win. I won the popular vote. I lost the Electoral College, but it could have gone the other way for Joe Biden too. So I think people who study American politics need to realize how insane this whole Electoral College is when you talk about a democracy, which is what we're supposed to be.
Should scrapping the Electoral College be the number one priority for Democrats from now on?
Well, I came out in favor of scrapping it in 2000 before I had any reason to believe it would affect me because of what it did to Al Gore. I thought,
Right.
Think about it. We've had Al Gore won the popular vote. I won the popular vote. Neither of us ended up in the White House. How bizarre is that? And so I think it should go. It will be practically impossible because it's embedded in the Constitution. So we've got to do everything we can to prevent the Republicans from changing the laws that govern elections in the states to try to make it impossible for Democrats to win again.
We've only got a few minutes left, but there's obviously I've got so much I want to ask you. But just one on this point, because you mentioned it, and Al Gore and you said earlier in our conversation that not a day went by while Donald Trump was president where you didn't ask yourself those questions. Just on a human level, almost as Hillary Clinton the person rather than the politician. What does that do to you? Does it still gnaw away at you? Those, are you sometimes thinking that rally we did, if only we hadn't done it in Cleveland, we should have done it in Madison, Wisconsin? Does that happen? Do you sort of go over it and over it and over it, or can you let go of it and move on a human level?
Well, I wrote a book about it because when it happened, I didn't understand it. I didn't understand how we were so off in all of our analyses and all of our polling and research. I didn't understand the full extent of voter suppression, both in person and online, that the Trump campaign had engaged in. Now we know that the Trump campaign was sharing very sensitive polling information with the Russians, and we know that they were partners in trying to suppress the vote. So I didn't know all of that when it happened. So I spent about 6 months writing a book called What Happened, and I think it stands up really well. But once I did that, it was cathartic for me. And what I turned my attention to was trying to literally sound the alarm so that it wouldn't happen again. We are still struggling with disinformation online. The tech companies have still not taken responsibility. And it's not only about elections, as serious as that is. Facebook is one of the primary sources of misinformation about vaccines, which is helping to fuel these horrible outbreaks of, COVID among children and on the unvaccinated. So I think there's still lessons that we should have learned from 2016. And part of the reason, at least in our country, it is not resolved. I mean, people fight about it still online, as you probably know, all the time, every day, is because people know that there was something off about it. It just wasn't on the level. And we don't know all of the reasons, and we don't understand everything that happened, but we know enough to know. So what I'm concerned about, what I'm focused on, is making sure it doesn't happen again. It's one of the first things I said to Joe Biden when he came to see me in the spring of 2019, I guess, to tell me he was going to run and to ask for advice. I said, just be really focused on what happens to you online. Just be really aware, which I was not, about the role that, malign outside interests can play. So we got to learn. We've got to defend our democracy. We can't take it for granted. That goes without saying these days.
That relates. This is going to have to be our last question. We've got just a few seconds left, but it does relate to this. Do you ever worry that the United States might be entering a kind of twilight period, a period of decline? And the reason I ask this is there's the defeat in Afghanistan. There's what you've just been talking about, which is half the society does not seem to believe in science, refusing to get vaccinated. You have a situation where one of the two main parties, by what you've said to us tonight, does not really believe in democracy. Do you worry that this is adding up to a society in its twilight? And as I say, this is going to be our last question, so this might be also your closing thought to us, Hillary Clinton.
No, I don't believe that, but I do believe we are in a struggle for the future of our country. The very ambitious, bold plans that President Biden has put forward, investing in research, in infrastructure, in supporting families, is exactly what our country needs to go forward with confidence and more equality and more justice into the future. And the other side wants to stop that. So yes, I think we're in a monumental, critically important political struggle right now. There's no doubt in my mind, the majority of the people agree with the agenda that Joe Biden has for the future, which is shared, by business, by academia, by so many people across the board. But the other side wants to rule by minority. It has a very powerful weapon in the filibuster in the Senate to rule by minority. It wants to change election laws so that it doesn't lose elections, despite what the will of the people might be. So this is a central struggle. But I don't think it's in any way a twilight. I think it's a very out in the open and the bright light of struggle that we need to make sure people understand what's at stake and enlist as many people as we possibly can to be successful in fighting back this revanchist obstructionist agenda that the other side is promoting.
Before I give a proper and full thank you to you, Hillary Clinton, I just want to mention a thank you to our audience for watching. For those of you who've come in with questions, we'd be delighted to hear your feedback. The short survey will pop up on your screen at the end. Thank you for supporting Guardian journalism. I was going to mention that if you'd like to contribute, support.theguardian.com/contribute. You can do that easily. And we do have another 9/11 related event on the 16th of September, 20 years since 9/11. What has changed for Muslim Americans? And that's at theguardian.com/Guardian Live. But mainly, I wanted to say a huge thank you on behalf of Guardian readers and those watching tonight to you, our special guest this evening, marking 20 years since 9/11 with us. A big, big thank you to you, Hillary Rodham Clinton.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thanks to The Guardian.